Welcome into the Locked On Knicks podcast. Today, I'm joined by Adam Armbrecht, the co-host of Locked On Nets, to tell you what exactly the Knicks are getting in Mikal Bridges.
You are Locked On Knicks, your daily New York Knicks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, guys, as promised, lucky enough to be joined by my buddy across, I was going to say the Hudson River. That was 10 years ago. Across the East River, I think. I don't really know the city that well. Adam Armbrecht, host of Locked On Nets. Thank you so much for joining me, Adam. Adam also hosts, this is neutral territory for us because I'm also a Giants fan. He hosts One Giant podcast, so be sure to check that out wherever you get podcasts. Adam, welcome to the show. I don't know if you heard, there was a Knicks-Nets trade for the first time in a while.
Honestly, we were just kind of working our way through the offseason, preparing for another, don't worry, we're going to be competitive. Brooklyn wants to make the playoffs. I mean, oddly enough, to peel back the curtain, we do our network mock drafts, and we were having communications. Hey, trade packages being offered. When this came through, this once-in-a-lifetime Knicks-Nets trade, it really was, I think, shocking for everybody on all sides that actually happened. They actually got the deal done. And from a Nets perspective, that it involved what I feel is a significant haul for Mikal Bridges, but it makes the Knicks better. So it's an interesting time in the city for sure.
Yeah, it's a good trade. We can litigate who won, who lost at the end. For now, I want to know a little bit more about Mikal Bridges. I want to start off in the good times, that 2022-23 season where he was obviously it was a 27-game regular season stretch where he was just exceptional. 26 points, just under 5 rebounds a game, just under 2 assists per game, 48% from the field, 38% from three, 89% from the line. Was solid in that 4-game series loss to the Philadelphia 76ers. What were you thinking about him during that initial 27-game run? Because I have a roommate who is a massive, massive Nets fan, and all I would hear around the house is like, you know what, man? I would have traded this guy for Kevin Durant straight up. He is ridiculous. He is going to be a multi-time All-Star, and the games I watched, the numbers he was putting up, I as someone who follows the Suns very closely, is like, I had never seen this from him before, but I could buy into that multi-time All-Star ceiling. He was playing like that. Obviously this season we'll get to was not quite as good, but were you ever that high on Mikal Bridges, or were you thinking it was the product of kind of maybe some fluky hot shooting?
Yeah, I mean, listen, yeah, he came in and was absolutely electric. And at the time, if you're a Brooklyn Nets fan, you're ending the superstar era, as unsuccessful as it may have been. You're saying goodbye to Kyrie. You already said goodbye to Harden. Now it's Kevin Durant. And you're thinking like, okay, organizationally, they're telling us this is going to be the guy. He's going to be the new centerpiece. But is he really? And while I don't think Doug and I ever got to the level of saying, hey, watch out, this guy's about to become, superstar status to wherever you make those rankings across the NBA, that 27-game sample size was eye-opening at the time to say, okay, like maybe we don't have to be as far away from staying competitive, from making the playoffs and being an exciting team. Unfortunately, I think as often is the case with bad teams, also over that run as you head towards the offseason, you think, but they didn't win a lot of games. They still, they didn't have success on the court. So sometimes you start to calibrate individual success versus team success, but that was kind of the sweet spot. And everything after that did start to dissipate in terms of how you felt about Mikal and what his future was going to be like in Brooklyn. But that little half season, baby, that was a sweet post-trade time when everything felt like Mikal Bridges could be the start of a different version of success for Brooklyn. Ultimately, it doesn't work out.
So what changes this season? The biggest thing I look like, even going back further from Brooklyn to Phoenix, because this was a guy where efficiency was never a question for him. He was one of the most efficient players in basketball, scoring 14 or more points per game. The number I zoomed to in Phoenix, despite the fact that he shot pretty terribly from 2-point range as a rookie, over those 5 years or so, he was a 58% 2-point shooter. In Brooklyn, just a 50% 2-point shooter. Obviously, it's very different when you have the ball in your hands. You get the top defender every night. A lot of times you get a second defender shaded your way. But did these struggles on offense go beyond just the role shift, or did you think it was as simple as that? Like he's a guy who was built to be an incredible number 3, a fine, solid number 2 on offense and is just not equipped at the end of the day to be a top option on a team that was obviously Cam Thomas is a bucket. No one denying that, even a Knicks hater over here, but was bereft of other options to draw a ton of attention away from him.
Yeah, the role shift is massive here. And I think one of the things that got exposed in the first full season for Mikal was ball in his hand. He is not a guy that is taking on a defender one-on-one, breaking him down off the dribble and creating space for himself. It's just not part of his game. And this is where the role exposed that. And it's not a knock on Mikal. It's a knock on the Brooklyn Nets. It's a knock on not having enough talent, on not being a complementarily built roster. Remember, when you start to trade away all your superstars, you're taking the best things that you can get. When you look at that roster construction after all those trades, you don't go, oh, these pieces really, what complementary aspects we have here. You mentioned, Cam Thomas, he's a bucket, but he's still developing his on-ball skills, his, point guard kind of mentality he's able to bring. We saw a lot of that over the season too. So from a Mikal standpoint, I think you saw him try. He was trying to take on that mantle of being that player. And then we started to shift where the times that you watched him just get slowly eaten up going towards the basket. And again, that's not a knock on his game. It's the reality of what defenses have to prepare for. There's no one else to worry about. Okay, so we can shadow you going to the rim, and you don't have the quick first step to beat us off the dribble, so we're going to clean you up there. Then, even though he is a very efficient or effective three-point shooter, over the time in Brooklyn, you saw him kind of start to shy away a little bit from that, get into that mid-range game you talk about, and lean into what was working. Hey, I'll be the king of the mid-range. I'll get my spots. I'll get my buckets. Ultimately, again, down the stretch of that 27 games into this year, it became two things. The 27 games is other teams saying, who cares? We're going to win this game either way. This is the classic, well, we'll stop Luka and we'll let the others beat us, right? Reverse engineer it. It doesn't matter what anybody does. Let everybody get everything. The team isn't good enough to put up enough points to win. Fast forward to this year. Now you're telling us that Mikal Bridges is the leader of this team and he's the number one. We'll go ahead and we'll give defensive attention to him. We'll go ahead and run blitzing actions at him. We'll go ahead and make clogging the paint a priority and see if he can navigate through that. And that starts to deteriorate what his value is and what everybody's value is on this team. So I think it's a product just of being overexposed based on where he should be in a pecking order on a roster and where the Nets were. You're our best player. Maybe Cam Thomas overtakes that over the course of the season. He definitely does. But at the time, you're our best player. And if that's the case, a team like that is going to be in a real difficult spot night over night.
Do you think this year will have repercussions down the road in terms of benefiting his offensive game, like having to take on that number one mantle, something that if he had stayed in Phoenix, he never would have gotten that experience? And for the Knicks specifically, I'm thinking about the minutes that Jalen Brunson is off the floor, where a little bit less so in this year's playoffs, despite the rash of injuries, but 2 years ago in particular, pretty much cost them against the Miami Heat, where they would stay level, they would win the Brunson minutes, and they would just get killed in those other minutes. And now you kind of have the ability to do what the Sixers do with Joel Embiid, which is say, all right, our alpha's off the floor, we're throwing everything else at you. And for the Knicks this year, that looks like Dante DiVincenzo, Mikal Bridges, OG Anunoby, Julius Randle. Like, you can put out really strong lineups, and maybe, and probably not even maybe, if Randle's on the floor, he is probably still the fulcrum of that and the number one option there. But for those minutes that Bridges is on the floor, has to be the number one guy or like a top tier number two against opposing bench units. Do you think he's maybe a little bit more well equipped to that, or is he still better off as someone who's really just attacking a scrambled defense?
No, I mean, I think like you can go back and look, like there are stretches down this last season for Mikal in Brooklyn. And, if you read the tea leaves and we think about, and again, no judgment is being passed by this. He's talking with his buddies on the Knicks. He basically is saying, I prefer to be over there than to be in Brooklyn. That's all good. But if you start to look at his game, you can go track those stats where he is putting up 11, 10, 12, 9, 14 shots from beyond the arc. I think you already saw him starting to shift into. So to your question, is that going to hurt putting him into a bigger role? No, because I think that actually sample size told himself and maybe other teams like the Knicks, hey, he's best suited to be a 3-and-D type of mold player. High volume from beyond the arc. If you have more players like a Jalen Brunson that draws defensive attention, creates space for them, you have bigger players, more athletic players on New York than Brooklyn did, you're going to create really favorable matchups for him, specifically on the outside. And then if you're speaking to when Brunson is off the court, that's interesting. I think that comes down to the complementary pieces. Can you rely on Mikal for short bursts in that role? Of course you can. It's not dumping him that he can never bring the ball up or set up the offense or try to break defenses down and get to the mid-range. he was able to successfully still navigate to the paint and get those mid-range shots off in spite of a lack of real shooting around him in Brooklyn. So I think those non-Brunson minutes can be that. Hey, if we have spacing, if we open up that paint, Mikal has a high basketball IQ. He'll get to those spots and he'll probably turn off and on. Where is my best skill value when I'm on with the starters and everyone and we're all firing and I'm out there on the wing, or when I need to fill some non-starter minutes maybe and help the bench? That's when I lean into that king of the mid-range kind of mentality.
All right, guys, we'll be back with Adam in just a sec to continue talking Mikal Bridges. I want to get a feel for why his defense took a step back. Offense, you can kind of understand situationally why it wasn't as good. Defensively, I want to know, is that guy who finished second in the league in Defensive Player of the Year voting still in there? We find out next. But first, I want to tell you about our good friends over at Game Time. Game Time is an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets faster and easier. Price on the Game Time app actually go down the closer gets the first pitch with killer last deals, all in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee. Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets. I love Game Time. In fact, when I was in Phoenix in the fall, I got a chance to use them to go to a Knicks game, and it was a wonderful experience. Why did I trust Game Time? Well, beyond the fact that they're a Locked On sponsor, the biggest thing for me was the lowest price guarantee. I knew if I could find a lower price on any other ticketing site, Game Time would credit me 110% of the difference. And in my mind, why would I ever use another site when I know Game Time inherently has the lowest price each and every time? They also offer all-in pricing where you can toggle a feature that shows the total up front, so there are no surprise fees at checkout. Trust me, that is my least favorite thing when buying a ticket. Game Time ticket coverage means your ticket is covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. So take all the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 on your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. If you want to watch Jalen Brunson drop 50 like me, download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Yeah, I hear that. Was there anywhere offensively in his year and a half there you noticed a leap? He posted the best assist percentage by far of his career this season. To me, that is probably just a product of being on the ball dramatically more than he's ever been in his career. But did you see him, like, as the year went on, like, improving in any way? Like, figuring out, like, all right, I'm going to get blitzed here, so I need to make this pass at this time. Like, was there a jump? Or to me, watching from afar at times, like, it just sort of felt like it broke him a little bit as a player, because to your point, like, that's just not who he is. But what was there anything positive that came out of this year for him offensively?
It's not a knock. Again, the three-pointing and leading back into that is a good thing. No, there wasn't a ton of positives coming out of this year. But I also think it was just a gradual breakdown of spirit. And that's not an excuse for him, but you're on a bad team. You probably know that you don't want to be there. And it's not like there's any help coming, right? There wasn't any moves made here. He's there with Cam Johnson, the twins, as they were known. He has his injuries. He's in and out of the lineup, right? So you're also dealing with that too. And I don't think the way the Nets were constructed, or still are in some ways, when you have a player like Nicholas Claxton, non-shooting big, Day'Ron Sharpe plays, but then kind of gets dumpstered into the bench rotation at times. Noah Clowney, who I actually think would have been fun to watch with Mikal, but the Nets don't get him onto the court until the latter stages of the season. When you have that lack of shooting talent around you, even the spike in assist numbers, that's really based off of Cam Thomas and almost solely Cam Thomas. When they get Dennis Schroeder, that's kind of interesting because you get another ball handler in here. But by that point, I think it's too little too late. I put nothing at his feet. You want every player. I don't want players checking out or feeling like they're mailing it in. But I also think that was a grind. And Mikal said it in the media. Like, he came out and said, it has been rough. I'm not doing enough. I want to be doing more. I need to be the guy for this team. We're grinding. We're trying to get through it. But if you're on a team that's losing more often than not, and that on a night in, night out basis, you're seeing defenses just be able to absolutely brutalize you on that end of the floor, I think at some point you throw your hands up and say, this is not going to be the version of my success at this point in my career, which is right now in the Knicks, entering what should be the peak of his career over this next 2-year window.
All right, so let's flip to the other side of the ball. The biggest complaint, I weirdly, Adam, I have a lot of Nets fans in my life. I don't know what I'm doing wrong. Maybe I'm doing something right. I don't know.
You're doing right. Yeah, come on now. You're doing all right.
I'm taking some shots. Anyways, and the biggest thing I've heard from all of them is he was not the player defensively we expected to get. Before we get into why, I want to just get into how. Like, what did he look like defensively to you, and was it disappointing when you get him and you say, all right, first and foremost, like we're getting one of the best defensive wings in basketball, and maybe he wasn't quite that in Brooklyn.
Yeah, and I think that's, again, exposure of role, right? Who are you taking on in Phoenix? And if you're taking on number one assignments, that's your sole focus for a possession, for a series, whatever it may be. In Brooklyn, again, I can relate to the offensive end too, because one of the things that we started to learn over time was, Mikal's frame, he is not a big body, and he's not a physical player. I mean, Jalen Brunson would be like the great, contrast here for the New York Knicks. He's smaller, but the guy's like a bull. And when he wants to get at the basket, he's going to go ahead and use every ounce of his body to do so. Mikal doesn't have that ability to play that type of physical style on offense. Defensively, same thing. So on the one hand, you have issues in the backcourt for the Brooklyn Nets where they're going to want to switch every single thing because it's either Cam Thomas, it's Schroeder, not a lot of great options there. So you're going to expose some of those matchups at times. If you want to put Mikal into the number one assignment POA, that's going to be a problem for him too. And physically, I thought that was the biggest thing. When you get matched up with the threes and sometimes the fours on switches, the physicality exposure there for Mikal was certainly glaring on the defensive end, where it was just hard. He didn't have the ability to stay in front of them, didn't have the ability maybe to physically keep them away from the paint or away from getting from their spots. Silver lining, if you want to go that way for New York, is you have bigger, more physical guys. So those assignments don't need to look like that for him. But I think that was the exposure there. Not enough size. Again, especially when you're talking about point guards getting at the basket, he doesn't have, I don't think he's quick enough to defend some of the faster players in the league. So there was some exposure there, but it may just be on a larger sample size than you ideally want him to be on the defensive end even.
Yeah, I guess in New York, to your point, OG Anunoby, as long as he's healthy, which is a knock on every piece of wood in Manhattan type of situation.
Oh, sure.
Yeah,
but it's massive though. You put him in front of that situation. You say, hey, the bigger, the harder, more defensive assignment, go take it. And then that secondary option, Mikal, then now I can be successful. And that's where I think, sorry, not to jump in, but that's where I think Knicks fans, we know it's going to happen. The puffing of the chest from the Knicks fan base as the season gets underway over to the Nets is going to be, look what you guys gave us. And the Nets, clapback will be, he was never going to be able to do that here. We didn't have any of these other guys. So it matters, man. Roster construction matters here. And that's why I think it's a great fit for Mikal in New York, because of these other pieces you have.
No, and I think that was the premise for the Knicks making the trade. What did you see from him? I think this is what you're getting at, like in terms of his strength as a help defender, because I know in Phoenix that was an area where he was always very good, hyper aware, those long arms, playing the passing lanes. I think the one demerit in that element of his game that I'm curious about what you saw is, like, I'm always surprised that he's not more of a shot blocker, and he kind of peaked there early in his career, because we saw someone like OG Anunoby, where, like, as much as he is just extraordinary on the ball, the most incredible part about his defense is that he can be guarding someone in the corner, see someone get beat on the perimeter, and can cover that 15, 20 feet or whatever, like make it to the rim and swat a shot. And Bridges, at least statistically, I didn't really see that there from him. And I think that would be a major boon to the Knicks, like if he was able to bring some of that, because it would allow them to play a little bit smaller. And we've been spending the last few days talking about this. Like, I do think their best configuration post Isaiah Hartenstein is probably Bridges, Randall, and Anunoby out there as your three bigs playing super small. But I think for that to be tenable, you have to take advantage of Bridges' freakish wingspan, and he's going to have to be kind of a secondary rim protector. Did he show any of that in Phoenix? And what were the other areas where he kind of excelled in terms of help defense?
Yeah, I wouldn't put secondary rim protector on his list. That would not be something that I would say, even with having some bigger players, obviously in New York, and saying your version of small, Brooklyn and New York's versions of small ball are two completely different things. I wouldn't say that, but you mentioned something about passing lanes. Like, that's actually, I think, spatial defense for Mikal Bridges with, as you mentioned, a 7'1" wingspan. That actually, to me, is where there's going to be more value here. So the stay-at-home ability for the New York Knicks defensively now, with Mikal playing out there on the perimeter, but watching some of those, if we're talking about point guard, top of the key, looking to spread the ball onto the perimeter, I think his active hands in passing lanes, his willingness and ability to go over on help defense, especially if we're talking about closeout situations on the perimeter, maybe some of those block shots do come back, because I like the idea of going over and helping on those backcourt assignments. Then the wingspan does come into effect there. And I think he has good recoverability too. If you're talking about shading over against point guard X, but then getting back out there to the wing. So I think that his real value defensively, and I mean this as a high compliment, is being team defense oriented. If everyone has their assignments in their space, if you want to flip to zone sometimes, he's going to offer you tremendous value. Again, part of the problems in Brooklyn is, one, from a role standpoint, maybe there is more, at the rim upside there, but that's Nicholas Claxton's bread and butter, right? Like, he's the guy that's going to be ranging for those plays. So I don't think you identify that as a need for Mikal. And then the other thing is, again, exposure by assignment. The Nets are a small team. They're an undersized team. You can triple switch them on a possession and keep getting to advantageous matchups. And I just don't think we used to look at Brooklyn early in the season and say, well, they got this scrambling kind of mentality defensively. Everyone's flying around. And for a while, we thought, because that's dedication and effort and hustle. And then we turned a little bit to, we don't know if everyone knows what they're supposed to be doing and if the assignments are correct or not. And that can be brutal for a player like Mikal Bridges, who knows what he needs to be doing, but maybe can't trust the others to hit their marks as needed.
I think the thing I'm most excited about from him defensively is just his ability to play in a blender. And that is not, to your point, that kind of scrambling around is not something the Knicks did a ton last year, because they were very positionally sound. And as Tom Thibodeau, I think, is better than any coach in the NBA for about 15 years running now, just funneling the ball to the baseline, like getting it into like advantageous spots for his defense, and then erasing it with two great rim protectors in Mikal Bridges and Isaiah Hartenstein. After Mitch went down in the playoffs, they had to pivot and play a little bit differently. They closed out game 4 against the Sixers with OG Anunoby essentially playing the 5, Precious Achiuwa playing the 4. And we got like this 4 or 5 minute stretch of this team just playing like this helter-skelter, like double the ball, rotate. And that is not sustainable over full games. I don't think that's something they go to in the regular season a ton. I think they will, at the end of the day, probably acquire a true blue rim protector, maybe Walker Kessler to be their second center. But in the playoffs, if they want to close games small, and if you're the Sixers and you have Joel Embiid, you say, all right, we're posting that up. If you're the Celtics, even with Kristaps Porzingis, you're saying, all right, you're going to put Anunoby on him. We're posting it up. And the Knicks are going to have to play doubling and scrambling and recovering. And to me, Bridges, with his length and his intelligence and his quick feet, is about as well equipped as any player in the league to excel in that style of defense. To your point, like in Brooklyn, like if you don't have other guys around you who are great, it doesn't really matter how good you are at that, because the defense is ultimately going to falter. A leak is going to spring, and it's all going to be over. Final thing on Bridges before we get to say some nice things about the Nets and all the value they got in this trade. I don't want to leave you empty-handed on this call, Adam. But
No.
What kind of person are the Knicks getting? Because I think when we talked about this and said it in a vacuum, like as subjective as I can be, as biased as I can be towards the Knicks, like it is tough to give up 5 first-round picks for a guy who's probably never going to make an all-star team at the end of the day. I think where people were ultimately okay with it, 1, his skill set fitting in perfectly, but 2, just as a person probably fitting in perfectly. What did you see just from Mikal Bridges, the human, over his 2 years in Brooklyn?
Yeah, I mean, listen, he said all the right things publicly, right? I mean, he came in dedicated. You come in with an opportunity maybe to take that next step in your career. The Brooklyn Nets are in an absolute dysfunctional kind of transitional period over those 2 years. You have your GM saying, we're going to make the playoffs. That's the goal. When it comes up short and you are the face of this Kevin Durant trade, you take a lot of it on your shoulders. So I thought he did a great job. Always coming to the media and saying, it's on me. I need to be better. I need to improve. I think he did a great job. All of his teammates, well-respected, well-regarded. Everyone in the league loves this guy, by the way. Like, the fact that we'll talk about the trade package, the fact that he ended up on the Knicks, every team, nothing was diminished in terms of his value or how other teams viewed him over this year and a half in Brooklyn. Every team would love to have this kind of player because he seemingly has the understanding of what's my role, what do you need me to do, and how can I best serve that? So when you go from Phoenix role player, Brooklyn, maybe opportunity to be the face, it doesn't quite work out. Now you come back into a team with all of his buddies, as we know, and you say, great, slot me in where I need to be. I don't think there's a lot of ego involved in Mikal Bridges' game. So you are getting that from a Thibodeau perspective, like, hey, I need another guy that's ready to come in, get it, run it, work it, and hustle with it. And you know that Jalen Brunson, that Hart, that these guys, that DiVincenzo, they're all talking and saying, like, we know the pedigree of this guy. So I don't think you get to the place where a trade like this goes down without the Knicks feeling like he checks every box that we need from a basketball standpoint. And then from a functional personality fit standpoint, you're getting a great player. Like, you're getting a great guy, a great player. Like, there's no knocks coming from the Brooklyn side on what Mikal Bridges is.
Okay, let's say some nice things about the Nets.
Yes, we
Yeah,
crushed it.
yeah, it's a great trade. I don't understand the Rockets giving. I know it was necessary for the Nets to do this trade and the Knicks to pull this off. If I'm Houston, I am holding the Nets' feet to the fire, and they're saying, "Oh, you want control of your franchise? You want to be able to tank the next few years? I want 4 first-round picks. I want 5 first-round picks. I want all the Suns picks. I want 1 or 2 of the Knicks picks." And to get it back for just 3 of those picks, credit to Sean Marks, extraordinary value there. Allows you to obviously make this trade, and like credit to Brooklyn. Like obviously they had an identity. Like KD, Kyrie want to come. Like however it worked out. Like you have to do it if you're Brooklyn, right? Like no questions asked. You sell your soul a little bit. That's fine. You guys would have won a championship if both those guys don't get hurt, and I don't think it would have been particularly close. And you would have walked over Mikal Bridges to do it in the finals. Like I think all that's fine. You can question what happened after. The Nets are in a great position going forward. How are you guys feeling about it?
Yeah, there's some speculation that the Houston conversation and the Knicks conversation was happening simultaneously with Sean Marks. So there's some world where Sean Marks is not fully telling Houston what is going on with New York. So to your point about how do we get back that control? What is it going to cost? Still pleasantly surprised that it was not as severe to do it. In theory, Houston wants those picks to be able to turn around and then still flip them for something else. Could you sit there and say, well, we could flip the Nets picks to do what we want to do? Of course. So I think the timeline of it becomes really fascinating, because if Brooklyn is posturing, we'll run it back with Mikal and Cam Johnson, and we'll be like, okay-ish, and those picks may not be that high. That's an interesting part of it. Getting through this draft is interesting. Yes, it's a weak class, but Houston still got that 3rd overall pick from Brooklyn, so they got to add Shepherd to their roster as well. I think that's a factor here too. On totality, listen, this is in no way throwing shade at the New York Knicks. The Nets getting back their next 2 years is critical. They have 4 first-round picks in next year's draft class. This will be very deep. Hopefully they spike and they have success. If I'm also Brooklyn, I can look over at New York and say, the value that you get here in making this trade and getting all these picks is that New York is kind of going short-term window here right now. So some of these picks further down the road could actually be a little bit more fruitful than Knicks fans maybe want to know right now, and probably than Knicks fans care. If it gets a championship and a deep playoff run, great, take all the picks in the world. But I think there's some like hidden value to that side of it as well. So from a Nets standpoint, we advocated for this on our show. Doug and I said, going back to the end of last season, after the 27 games with Mikal, we said, you need to move him. You need to move Johnson. You need to get the rebuild. That's what this team should be trying to do. Do everything you can to get pick control back from Houston. This ended up being an interesting way that they got there, but I never saw this level of value coming from New York in this package. The only thing I think, if you're talking Knicks side, is they seemed willing to give more than anybody else was going to. Like they seemed to be willing to say, it's open. What do you want? We want Mikal. We need Mikal. And that really spiked the value for Sean Marks and got to the place where they said, I think we have to make this trade based on what we're getting in return.
Yeah, I think there was sort of a perfect storm for Brooklyn in how much success the Knicks had in this playoff run, particularly down Julius Randle, down Mitchell Robinson. Like it almost pushed up the Knicks timeline a little bit. Like maybe like we'll see long-term, like in a bad way. Like if this team like just still isn't good enough, like you'll kind of be ruining that they did so well. But you see in Jalen Brunson, you have a guy who's arguably a top 5 player on planet Earth. Like I think undoubtedly like a top 10 to 12 player in the NBA at this point. And when that guy's 27 years old, like you can't let perfect be the enemy of good. And I think on our show, like we spent years talking like, all right, is it going to be Joel Embiid? Like, is Giannis going to ask out? And you're waiting, like even Devin Booker, and you're waiting for that type of star. And you, in some ways, had to settle for something a little less because that allowed you to maintain everything you have right now. If you're dealing for one of those other guys, like you're giving up all those picks, like, and Julius Randle and Dante DiVincenzo and Josh Hart maybe. And instead they're like, you know what, this is really good. Like who is the one player in the league that both financially, skill-wise, experientially, culturally fits in with all these guys and doesn't take anything away from them? Like, and Mikal Bridges is the answer where that worked financially and it works on the court. We know it works on the court. So he just became the perfect player. And because of that, Sean Marks had all the leverage in the world to say like, hey, we want everything if you're not going to give us a player back. And the Knicks kind of just had to say yes.
And I have one question from the Knicks side of it in that trade, because as we know, it's not technically finalized yet. The Knicks still have to figure out a couple of money pieces here. But the one thing I'll say for the Knicks too, positively, is I'm sure everyone loves Julius Randle and likes what he is right now. Mikal Bridges is going to be extension eligible at the beginning of October, and it's not a terrible extension. I think it's somewhere around 116 over 3 or 4 years. So like the numbers are going to be, I think it has to be over 4 years if the numbers feel good. But whatever that number works out to be, like that'll be an indication from a Knicks standpoint. What do we think the short term is? And then they have a nice pivot option. Like Julius Randle and his salary represents another opportunity to shift this roster a little bit. He's not significantly older, but he's a little bit older than a couple of these key players inside of their core. So I think the Knicks have an ability to kind of extend that timeline. That being said, are we getting Deuce? Is Deuce coming our way? Because it seems like the Knicks have run into a bit of a financial wall here just around making the money work. They can obviously send him out, move some money around. Where do the Knicks stand on buttoning up this deal for Mikal Bridges? Will they avoid sending McBride over to Brooklyn just as we'll trade him somewhere else before we'll send him into what is being perceived to be a very big package already?
Yeah, I think the urgency to figure things out financially is a little bit less so now that Isaiah Hartenstein is signed with another team. Right. But even regardless of that, with the brilliant work Brock Aller and the Knicks front office did in maneuvering around in the draft, it seemed like even regardless of that, they would have been able to fit Hartenstein. He ultimately just picked somewhere else, got a lot more money. Great for him. Yeah. At the end of the day, I don't think there's a pressing issue for the Knicks to shed money. Obviously, at this point, it's not going to open up anything in terms of a free agent center. The only way I could see it happening is if they looped in a third team. And like the name I mentioned before, the Jazz with Walker Kessler. And there was some world where, all right, we're sending Deuce to the Nets. The Nets are maybe sending like the least valuable of those Knicks picks to the Jazz. And the Knicks are getting Walker Kessler back. And something in that framework, that's the only way I see Deuce ending up in Brooklyn. I just think he's too valuable to this team. Like he's slated to be their backup point guard. If not, it would be Tyler Kolek, who's a rookie, who you, as a second round pick, you like seems ready to go. You don't know if you're going to survive like 8 minutes of him on the floor in a playoff game. Like Deuce McBride, even though he's not a point guard, like he is really freaking good. And he's proven he can do that. His handle's gotten a lot better. The shot is there. Like he is hitting jumpers with 15 seconds left to seemingly win the series against the Sixers before Tyrese Maxey goes crazy. Really good defender. I don't see any world where he is going to the Nets directly, again, unless the Nets are sending something else out and getting a third team involved and somehow getting the Knicks a center, which is not going to happen from Brooklyn.
I like the idea though of a Jazz trade where the Nets become that third team, not even including McBride, but just we know they've talked about whether it's expiring contracts and some of their veteran players that which is, we know that's where Brooklyn is now. Hey, expiring contract mode gets us another draft asset, maybe gets us something young. That's the mode that we think Brooklyn's going to be in now. So I would find that's probably going to be fascinating here. If this expands into a 3-team deal and the Knicks can make another big move, because I think that's where they're still at right now. Like, hey, okay, no Hartenstein, but we can maybe leap even further forward here if we can go get player X. If they can pull off something like that, it'll be interesting to see how the Nets stand to benefit. And then ultimately, like I think fans want to hear, back and forth and chattering across between two city rivals. I ultimately think that this worked out great. Like this worked out great for both sides. Brooklyn gets to reset itself, get into full rebuild mode, be really excited about what's ahead in the draft classes. And if you're the Knicks fan, again, the fan base knows this, like you should be bullish. You should be feeling confident. And when you watch what happens with Philadelphia and they get Paul George in the door, you knew that you needed to do something like this, because otherwise you could be staring down the Eastern Conference that feels easier, but is starting to get harder now, and teams are building up there. You're trying to chase down Boston. So I thought that this was great. And I'm happy for Mikal too, just at the high level. He's going to go play with his boys on a high level competitive team and hopefully get to return back to the best version of himself. So I walked away from this on a high level, regardless of these fine details, thinking both sides came out winning this. And that's usually a good scenario for both fan bases.
All right, across borough win-win, Adam. I'm excited to be doing this podcast with you in 8 years, where the Knicks have won 2 championships, and we're talking about the Nets getting an unprotected top 5 pick when the wheels fall off Jalen Brunson. But until then, I'm sure we'll keep you updated on Locked On Knicks, Locked On Nets. We'll talk to you soon on both pods.